We're going to look at the inquiry question, how do selection pressures within an ecosystem influence evolutionary change? And we're going to look at some evidence from past ecosystems. And the evidence we're going to consider includes Aboriginal rock paintings, which will take us back 60,000 years, rock structures and formations, they can take us all the way back 4 billion years, ice core drilling, which can take us back 800,000 years, pollen samples take us back 20,000 years, we've been keeping temperature records for about 350 years, and we can also use Dendrochronology, which is tree rings, which give us information about the last 3,000 years. So let's start with Aboriginal rock paintings. And this is the longest unbroken art tradition in the world, and it can give us all sorts of primary evidence. In other words, evidence recorded by the people who saw the event into things like changing ecosystems or climates, or the types of animals and plant life that were around, and the existence of megafauna. And you can see in the pictures here, we've got megafauna, which is anything over 40 kilograms. We've got birds that are now extinct, large mammals that are now extinct. And of course, this piece of evidence can be cross-referenced with other sources of evidence to help build up a big picture. We've got different types of rock paintings that are around different parts of Australia. In West Kimberley, we've got rock paintings that can be dated using radiometric dating by looking at the minerals underneath the layers of paint. And in these paintings from the West Kimberley, we can see insects being depicted. And that will give us a clue as to the environment that those insects were living in at that date when they were painted. There's also a huge number of rock arts called the Bradshaw paintings. It's a collection of rock art. And in these paintings, you can see all sorts of things. Humans with all the different accessories, like jewelry that they're wearing. Megafauna like thylacines. All sorts of lush, open, tropical forests dating anywhere from 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, and then a change into a glacial period where, not necessarily glacial in Australia, but there were grasslands in Australia because during glacial periods, lots of water gets locked up in our planet, which means that there is a drought. And you get to see this depiction of drought in the artwork. And the last example I'll show you gives us a clue about changing ecosystems. So you see rock art of reptiles found in the Keep River area where you just wouldn't get reptiles like this nowadays. So a very different ecosystem. Another form of evidence is to look at rock structures and formations, and this is the one that gives us most information furthest back. And in Australia, we're extremely lucky. Over in the Northern Territory and also in Western Australia, there are fossilised rocks called stromatolites, and they look like these sort of mushroom-shaped images here that we've got in this picture, and they actually were the earliest forms of colonial life. They are layers and layers of single-celled bacteria and then grit sticking into that bacteria, sort of goo that the bacteria make, and they were very much the earliest life forms on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. We've also got in our rocks in Australia banded iron formation. So you see this stripy rock here is where you get layers of rock with iron oxide interspersed with layers with silicon dioxide, and it's showing evidence in the rock record from a long time ago, so 2 billion years ago, of the first photosynthesizing events happening. Now we can't see the photosynthesizing organisms in the rocks, but those rocks would not be formed without oxygen. So we know that oxygen was being made and it was reacting with the elements in the water in the oceans, and there was rust forming, that's the iron oxide, and it was sinking to the bottom of the ocean and becoming layers of sedimentary rock. So this is giving us ideas about the atmosphere and the different selection pressures that were existing in these past ecosystems. Here we have an image of coal. Coal is a sedimentary rock and it forms from very lush rich plant matter, usually in swamps. When those plants fall off the trees or fall off the bushes or grasses or ferns, they get compressed, but they don't decompose, and they become sedimentary rock called coal. And in this picture here, you can even see fossilized ferns. So coal gives us an idea of the ecosystem that was happening, the kind of weather. So it was nice and warm and swampy and moist. So that's the only way you could get enough greenery to make the big seams of coal that we have in different areas of Australia. And similarly, halite, which is rock salt, tells us that in that area there must have been lots of shallow seas, and sometimes those shallow seas evaporated, leaving behind the salt from the salty water in the sea, and that has become rock salt, big seams of rock salt in different areas of Australia. So again, giving us ideas of wetlands or selection pressures such as salty water in the area, so that we can take a guess at the kinds of ecosystems that were happening when that rock was formed. So other information we can get is from ice core drilling. So this is when we make a hole through either snow or through ice in glaciers, and you can actually look really far back in time, 800,000 years, because these glaciers haven't melted for that long, and it traps in that ice as the snow falls, and each layer of snow compacts the layer below it. The deeper layers are really old, the surface layers are much newer, and in amongst all of that you can see dust and pollen, and you can even get bubbles of ancient gas from atmospheres, maybe even radioactive particles, all trapped in there in an order that gives us a timeline. And what you actually see from that are these ice core sort of drills, these sort of 10 centimeters wide, and they can be several meters long, and they store them in big freezers. And then people who are paleo-atmospheric scientists come along and look at the blend of oxygen isotopes trapped in the bubbles and try to work out what was going on in the atmosphere at that time. And similarly, we've got a core here, but it's not an ice core. See there in the middle, it's not an ice core, it's a core of mud or peat, and that has trapped pollen in it. So we get some great data of the exact plants that were around at the time, because we can have a look at these fossilized pollen grains that you can see in the picture, and you can compare those pollen grains to plants that are producing pollen today and get a really good idea as to what was in that area and in that ecosystem. And the final bit of evidence that we can use when we're looking at past ecosystems is dendrochronology. So as tree rings form, they grow at different rates in the summer versus the winter, and it gives us different types of wood, and you can see that in the pattern of rings. And we can actually overlap tree ring patterns. So you can see in this picture here, from a living tree to a dead tree to a very old dead tree, and perhaps even to fossilized dead trees that have their rings still intact in the fossils, and we can overlap those, and we can actually match up different seasons in different parts of the country, and you can get a really good feel for whether they were hot years, wet years, drought years, and match those up to other bits of evidence that we have, maybe from the pollen record, maybe from the ice core record, maybe from rock records. So you can start to build a really complex picture where the evidence backs up other pieces of evidence, so we can be confident of what the selection pressures, the abiotic factors were at that time.